The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the old bus as it pulled into the Riverside Women's Correctional Facility. Sarah Chun sat in the back row, her wrists shackled to a chain around her waist, watching the gray concrete walls grow larger through the dirty glass. To anyone looking at her, she appeared to be just another criminal being transported to prison. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and she wore the standard orange jumpsuit that marked her as an inmate. But appearances can be deceiving. Sarah Chun was actually Admiral Sarah Chun, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Navy and a former Navy SEAL. She had spent 15 years serving her country in some of the most dangerous missions around the world. She had led teams through hostile territories, rescued hostages from enemy compounds, and earned more medals than most soldiers see in a lifetime. But today, she was playing a very different role. 3 months ago, Sarah had been approached by the FBI with an unusual request. Women inmates at Riverside Correctional were disappearing. Not escaping, disappearing entirely. Some were found dead weeks later in remote locations, while others simply vanished without a trace. The families of these women begged for answers, but every official investigation had hit a dead end. The prison administration claimed they knew nothing, and the guards insisted everything was normal. That's when the FBI decided they needed someone on the inside. Someone with the skills to survive in a hostile environment, and the training to gather intelligence without being detected. Admiral Chun had volunteered immediately. She had 2 daughters of her own, and the thought of young women being hurt or killed made her blood boil. The plan was simple but dangerous. Sarah would assume the identity of Sophia Martinez, a woman convicted of armed robbery who was supposed to arrive at Riverside that same day. The real Sophia had agreed to cooperate with the FBI in exchange for a reduced sentence and was now safely hidden in witness protection. Sarah would take her place, investigate the disappearances, and report back to her FBI contact through carefully planned methods. But as the bus lurched to a stop and the guards began shouting orders, Sarah realized that no amount of training could have prepared her for what she was about to face. The first guard who boarded the bus was a massive man with arms covered in tattoos. His name tag-read Officer Brooks, and his eyes were cold as winter steel. He looked at each prisoner with obvious disgust, like they were insects he wanted to crush under his boot. "Listen up, ladies," Brooks shouted, his voice echoing through the bus. "Welcome to Riverside. This ain't some fancy hotel. You follow our rules, or you suffer the consequences. And trust me, you don't want to find out what those consequences are." Sarah kept her head down and tried to look scared. It wasn't hard. Even with all her training, the reality of being locked up was intimidating. She had to remind herself that she was here by choice and that she could theoretically leave at any time if her cover was blown. But for now, she was Sophia Martinez, a scared young woman who had made some bad choices. The prisoners were led off the bus in single file, their chains clanking with each step. The prison yard was surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire, and guard towers loomed overhead like medieval fortresses. Sarah noticed that the guards in the towers all carried rifles and seemed to track every movement in the yard below. As they shuffled toward the main building, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the other inmates. Women of all ages stood behind barred windows, watching the new arrivals with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Some called out warnings or advice, but the guards quickly silenced them with threats and harsh words. The intake process was exactly as brutal as Sarah had been warned it would be. The new prisoners were lined up in a cold, sterile room and told to strip completely. Sarah had undergone similar procedures during her military training, but this felt different. The guards here weren't professionals trying to maintain security. They seemed to enjoy the power they held over these vulnerable women. Officer Brooks stood with 2 other guards, Officer Martinez, no relation to Sarah's assumed identity, and Officer Thompson. All 3 men watched the proceedings with leering grins that made Sarah's skin crawl. When it was her turn to be searched, she forced herself to remain calm and compliant. "Well," Officer Brooks said, looking her up and down, "looks like we got ourselves a pretty one here. What's your name, sweet thing?" "Sophia Martinez," Sarah replied quietly, keeping her eyes on the floor. Sophia, Brooks repeated, drawing out each syllable. That's a real pretty name. I bet you're going to be real popular here. The way he said it made Sarah's stomach turn, but she had to stay in character. Sophia Martinez was supposed to be intimidated and afraid. So that's exactly what Sarah pretended to be. The strip search was humiliating and thorough. The guards made her bend over, squat, and assume various positions while they examined every inch of her body. They claimed they were looking for contraband, but Sarah could tell they were taking their time and enjoying the process far more than necessary. During the search, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. On Officer Thompson's desk, partially hidden under some paperwork, was a photograph. Even upside down and from several feet away, Sarah could make out the image clearly. It showed a young woman who looked terrified, and she was holding what appeared to be a newspaper with a date on it. Sarah recognized the technique immediately. It was proof of life photo, the kind taken by kidnappers to prove their victims were still alive. Sarah forced herself not to react, but her mind was racing. If the guards were involved in the disappearances, then her mission had just become infinitely more dangerous. She was no longer just investigating. She was now a potential target herself. After the strip search, the new inmates were given prison uniforms and assigned to their cells. Sarah was placed in cell block D, which she had been told was where several of the missing women had been housed. Her cellmate was a woman named Rosa, who had been at Riverside for 2 years on drug charges. Rosa was a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes, but Sarah could see the hardness that prison life had carved into her features. As they sat on their narrow bunks that first night, Rosa shared some crucial information. "You seem different from most of the girls who come through here," Rosa said quietly, glancing toward the cell door to make sure no guards were listening. "Got some advice for you. Stay away from the guards, especially Brooks and his crew. They run things around here, and not in a good way." Sarah leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Rosa hesitated, clearly afraid to say too much. "Girls have gone missing. Good girls who didn't cause no trouble. One day they're here, next day they're gone. Administration says they got transferred or released early for good behavior. But," she shook her head, "I've been here 2 years. I know how this place works. Those girls didn't get transferred nowhere." "What happened to them?" Sarah asked. "That's the million-dollar question," Rosa replied. "But I got my theories. See, Brooks and his boys, they run what they call special programs. Girls get selected for kitchen duty, laundry work, maintenance jobs. Stuff that takes them away from the general population. Some of those girls never come back." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Have you reported this to anyone?" Rosa laughed bitterly. "Who am I going to report it to? The warden? Half the staff here isn't on it. The other half is too scared to speak up. And us inmates? We're just criminals. Nobody believes a word we say." That night, as Sarah lay on her thin mattress listening to the sounds of the prison around her, she began to understand the magnitude of what she was facing. This wasn't just a case of a few corrupt guards. It seemed like there was an entire network operating within the prison walls, and they had been getting away with it for years because nobody cared what happened to convicted criminals. The next morning brought Sarah's first real test. During breakfast in the cafeteria, Officer Brooks approached her table with a clipboard in his hand. "Martinez," he called out, "you're being assigned to special kitchen duty. Report to the main kitchen after lunch." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but she kept her expression neutral. According to Rosa, kitchen duty was one of the assignments that girls often didn't return from. But she couldn't refuse without breaking character and potentially blowing her cover. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. As Brooks walked away, Rosa grabbed Sarah's arm. "Don't go," she whispered urgently. "Find a way to get out of it. Start a fight. Get yourself thrown in solitary. Anything. Just don't go to that kitchen." But Sarah knew she had no choice. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she had come here to investigate. If the kitchen was where the missing women had last been seen, then that's where she needed to be. The morning passed slowly as Sarah tried to prepare herself mentally for whatever she might face. During her years as a Navy SEAL, she had been trained to handle torture, interrogation, and life-threatening situations. But this was different. She couldn't fight back or use her skills without revealing who she really was. She had to rely on her wits and her ability to blend in while gathering intelligence. As lunchtime approached, Sarah noticed that several other inmates were also called for various work assignments. She watched carefully to see which guards were involved and tried to memorize their faces and names. Officer Martinez seemed to be coordinating most of the assignments, while Brooks supervised the overall operation. When it was time to report to the kitchen, Sarah took a deep breath and made her way through the prison corridors. The kitchen was located in the basement level of the main building, down a long hallway lined with storage rooms and mechanical equipment. As she walked, Sarah noticed that there were no security cameras in this section of the prison, a detail that struck her as highly suspicious. The kitchen itself was larger than she had expected, with industrial-grade equipment and multiple preparation areas. But what caught her attention immediately was how few people were actually working there. For a facility that housed over 800 inmates, she would have expected to see dozens of women preparing meals. Instead, there were only 5 or 6 inmates visible, and they all looked nervous and afraid. "You must be the new girl," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a middle-aged woman in a chef's uniform approaching. Her name tag identified her as Supervisor Kelly. "I'm the kitchen supervisor. You'll be working the prep station today." Supervisor Kelly showed Sarah to a corner of the kitchen where she would be washing and cutting vegetables. It seemed like routine work, but Sarah noticed that Kelly kept checking her watch and glancing toward a door-marked storage at the far end of the kitchen. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to understand the layout of the kitchen and identify the key players. Besides Supervisor Kelly, there were 2 other civilian employees, both men who seemed to have authority over the inmate workers. The guards who brought inmates to and from the kitchen all seemed to know each other well, suggesting they were part of a regular rotation. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah witnessed something that made her blood run cold. A young woman named Carmen, who had been working at the prep station next to Sarah's, was called over by one of the civilian supervisors. Sarah watched as Carmen was led toward the storage room door. The woman looked terrified, but she followed obediently. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Carmen never came back. When Sarah asked another inmate what had happened to Carmen, the woman just shook her head and looked away. "Mind your own business," she whispered. "It's safer that way." As her first day of kitchen duty came to an end, Sarah was escorted back to her cell block by Officer Thompson. During the walk, she tried to engage him in conversation to gather more information. "That kitchen's pretty big," she commented casually. "Yeah, it is," Thompson replied. "Feeds a lot of people. You did good work today." Supervisor Kelly was impressed. "Will I be working there again tomorrow?" Sarah asked. Thompson smiled, but there was something predatory about his expression. "Oh, I think you'll be working there a lot. Pretty girl like you. You got potential for advancement." The way he said advancement made Sarah's skin crawl, but she forced herself to smile and nod. "That sounds good. I just want to do my time and get out of here." "That's a smart attitude," Thompson said as they reached cell block D. "Keep thinking like that, and you might just find yourself with some special opportunities." That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk, she reflected on everything she had learned during her first full day at Riverside. The corruption was deeper and more extensive than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just a few bad guards taking advantage of vulnerable inmates. It was an organized operation involving multiple levels of staff. The disappearance of Carmen had confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Women were being taken from the kitchen and other work assignments, and they were simply vanishing. Whether they were being killed, sold, or transported somewhere else, Sarah didn't yet know. But she was determined to find out. Rosa could sense that something was bothering her new cellmate. "You okay, Sophia?" she asked quietly. "You seem worried about something." Sarah turned to face her. "That girl Carmen who was working in the kitchen today. What happened to her?" Rosa's expression grew dark. "Same thing that happens to all of them. She got selected." "Selected for what?" "Nobody knows for sure," Rosa replied. But once you get selected, you don't come back. Maybe they ship you somewhere else, maybe something worse. All I know is I've seen it happen a dozen times, and I don't want it to happen to you. As the lights went out and the prison settled into its nighttime routine, Sarah began planning her next moves. She needed to get more information about the storage room where Carmen had been taken. She needed to identify all the staff members involved in the operation. And most importantly, she needed to find a way to communicate with her FBI contact without being detected. But as she closed her eyes and tried to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers. And somewhere in the darkness of Riverside Correctional, other women were probably wondering if they would see another sunrise. Admiral Sarah Chun had faced enemy combatants in the mountains of Afghanistan and the jungles of South America. She had survived situations that would have broken most people. But lying in that narrow prison bunk, surrounded by concrete walls and the sounds of despair, she realized that this mission might be the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted. The hunt for the truth had begun, and Sarah was now both the hunter and the hunted. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah began working in the kitchen, and she had established herself as a model prisoner. She kept her head down, followed orders without question, and avoided drawing attention to herself. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior, Admiral Sarah Chun was methodically gathering intelligence that would have impressed her former Navy SEAL teammates. Every day brought new horrors and revelations. Sarah had witnessed 6 more women disappear during her kitchen assignments. Each time, the pattern was the same. A guard or supervisor would call the woman over for a private conversation, lead her to the storage room, and she would never be seen again. The official explanation was always the same: early release for good behavior or transfer to another facility. But Sarah knew better. During her second week, Sarah had managed to get close enough to the storage room to hear voices coming from within. What she heard made her stomach turn. There were men's voices discussing merchandise and delivery schedules. They talked about the women like they were products being bought and sold. One voice mentioned overseas buyers and high-dollar clients. Another discussed breaking in the new ones and making sure they were properly trained. Sarah realized she was dealing with something far worse than simple corruption or even murder. This was human trafficking on an industrial scale, and the prison was being used as a recruitment center. The most vulnerable women in society, those who had already been abandoned by the system, were being sold into sexual slavery. The knowledge weighed heavily on Sarah's mind, but she knew she had to be patient. She needed concrete evidence, names, dates, and details about the operation before she could act. One wrong move would blow her cover and likely get her killed. Her opportunity came on a Tuesday morning when Supervisor Kelly approached her with an unusual request. "Sophia," Kelly said, her voice carrying a tone Sarah had learned to recognize as dangerous. "You've been doing excellent work. I think you're ready for some additional responsibilities." Sarah looked up from the potatoes she was peeling, keeping her expression neutral. "What kind of responsibilities?" "There's a special dinner being prepared tonight for some VIP visitors," Kelly explained. "We need someone reliable to help at the serving. It's an honor to be selected for this kind of work." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to appear pleased. "Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down." Kelly smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you won't. Report back here at 6 o'clock tonight." "And Sophia?" She paused, studying Sarah's face carefully. "Make sure you look your best. First impressions matter with these particular guests." As Kelly walked away, Sarah felt a chill run through her body. She had heard enough conversations to know that special dinners were code for something much darker. Based on the intelligence she had gathered, she suspected she was about to come face to face with the people running the trafficking operation. That afternoon, Sarah used her time in the recreation area to observe the prison's layout more carefully. She had been mapping the facility in her mind, noting security camera locations, guard rotations, and potential escape routes. Her military training had taught her to always have multiple exit strategies, and She had a feeling she might need them soon. She also took the opportunity to speak with Rosa, who had become her closest ally within the prison walls. Rosa had been keeping an ear out for information about the missing women, and she had learned something disturbing. "I talked to a girl in cell block B," Rosa whispered as they sat in a corner of the recreation room. "She said her roommate Maria got selected for a special dinner last month. Maria was supposed to come back the next day, but she never did. The guard said she got transferred, but the girl never got any paperwork or explanation." Sarah nodded grimly. "How many women have disappeared in the past 6 months?" "At least 20 that I know of," Rosa replied. "Maybe more. It's hard to keep track because they spread them out across different cell blocks, and they're careful not to take too many from the same area at once." "What kind of women are they targeting?" Sarah asked. Rosa thought for a moment. "Young ones mostly. Pretty ones. Girls who don't have family on the outside asking questions. They seem to prefer inmates who are here for nonviolent crimes, drug possession, theft, stuff like that. Nobody who's likely to fight back or cause trouble." This information confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the selection criteria. The traffickers were choosing victims who would be both desirable to their clients and unlikely to be missed by the outside world. It was a calculated and ruthless operation. As 6 o'clock approached, Sarah prepared herself mentally for whatever she was about to encounter. She had hidden a small piece of metal from the kitchen in her uniform. Not enough to be considered a weapon, but something she could use if she needed to pick a lock or defend herself. She also made sure to memorize the layout of every corridor between her cell and the kitchen. When she arrived at the kitchen, Sarah immediately noticed that the atmosphere was different. The usual chaos of meal preparation was replaced by an almost ceremonial precision. Only a handful of inmates were present, all of them young and attractive women who looked nervous and scared. Supervisor Kelly was dressed more formally than usual, and she was accompanied by 2 men Sarah had never seen before. Both men wore expensive suits and carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to power and wealth. One was tall and silver-haired, probably in his 50s, with cold blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around him. The other was younger, perhaps 40, with dark hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Ladies," Kelly announced to the assembled inmates, "tonight you have the privilege of serving some very important guests. You will follow all instructions without question, and you will remember that you represent this facility. Any inappropriate behavior will result in serious consequences." The women nodded silently, but Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. Whatever these special dinners involved, the other inmates had heard enough stories to be terrified. The group was led out of the kitchen and down a corridor Sarah had never seen before. They passed through several locked doors, each one bringing them deeper into the administrative section of the prison. Finally, they arrived at what appeared to be a private dining room, complete with elegant furniture and expensive decorations. The contrast with the rest of the prison was jarring. While the inmates lived in cramped, dirty cells with barely functioning plumbing, this room looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Crystal glasses sparkled on white tablecloths, and the air smelled of expensive cologne and fine wine rather than the usual prison odors of disinfectant and despair. Already seated at the table were 4 men who radiated wealth and power. Sarah recognized the type immediately from her military briefings on international crime syndicates. These were not street-level criminals, but sophisticated businessmen who happened to trade in human misery. The silver-haired man from the kitchen took his place at the head of the table and gestured for the inmates to begin serving. Sarah was assigned to pour wine and bring food from the kitchen, which gave her the opportunity to listen to the conversation without drawing attention to herself. What she heard confirmed her worst fears and provided crucial intelligence for her mission. "The Eastern European route is becoming too risky," one of the men was saying as Sarah poured his wine. "Too much attention from law enforcement. That's why this arrangement is so perfect," replied another. "Domestic sourcing eliminates all the border complications, and the quality is excellent." The silver-haired man nodded approvingly. The selection process has been refined over the past year. We're only taking candidates who meet the specific requirements of our clients. As Sarah moved around the table, she learned that the operation was far more extensive than she had imagined. The men discussed other prisons in different states, shipping schedules, and client preferences with the casual efficiency of any business meeting. They mentioned specific names and locations that Sarah committed to memory, knowing this information would be vital for bringing down the entire network. One detail that particularly caught her attention was a reference to a ship called the Maritime Explorer that was scheduled to dock in Miami the following week. Based on the context of the conversation, it seemed like this ship was being used to transport victims to international destinations. As the evening progressed, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere in the room was becoming increasingly predatory. The men were drinking heavily, and their comments about the serving women were becoming more explicit and threatening. Several times, Sarah felt hands groping her as she served food and drinks, but she forced herself to remain in character and not react. Around 10 o'clock, the silver-haired man stood up and made an announcement that chilled Sarah to the bone. "Gentlemen, I think it's time to inspect tonight's selection. As you know, we guarantee the quality of our merchandise." The other men murmured their approval, and Sarah realized with horror that this special dinner had just been the preliminary part of the evening. Now came the real purpose of the gathering. Supervisor Kelly began calling names, and Sarah watched as 3 of the younger inmates were separated from the group. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable, but they followed orders because they had no choice. In prison, disobedience meant punishment, and punishment could be worse than anything they might face by complying. "Sophia," Kelly called out. "You too." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice, but she knew she had no choice but to play along. Breaking character now would not only blow her mission, but also likely result in her death. She joined the other 3 women, trying to project the same terrified compliance they were showing while her mind raced through potential escape scenarios. The selected women were led to an adjacent room that had been set up like a grotesque auction house. There were chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a raised platform, and bright lights illuminated the stage area. Sarah realized that this was where the traffickers evaluated their victims before deciding which ones to purchase. The silver-haired man, who appeared to be the leader of the operation, explained the process with the detached professionalism of someone conducting a business transaction. "Each candidate has been medically examined and psychologically evaluated," he told his clients. "We provide complete documentation of their criminal history, family connections, and likelihood of being missed if they disappear. We also guarantee that all candidates have been properly processed to ensure compliance." Sarah felt sick as she listened to him describe human beings like livestock, but she forced herself to focus on gathering intelligence. She noticed security cameras in the room and made note of their positions. She also observed that there were at least 6 guards present, all of them armed. One by one, the women were called onto the platform and forced to undergo humiliating examinations while the men evaluated them like commodities. Sarah watched in horror as her fellow inmates were reduced to nothing more than objects for sale. When it was Sarah's turn, she had to call upon every ounce of her military training to maintain her composure. As she stood on that platform under the harsh lights, with strange men examining her body and discussing her market value, she felt a rage building inside her that threatened to overwhelm her careful self-control. But she also noticed something that gave her hope. Near the back of the room, partially hidden behind some equipment, was a security monitor that showed the feeds from all the cameras in this section of the prison. More importantly, she could see that some of the feeds were being recorded. If she could access those recordings, she would have the evidence needed to expose the entire operation. The auction itself was conducted with the efficiency of any other business transaction. The men bid on the women using hand signals and whispered conversations, while the silver-haired man recorded their selections on a tablet computer. Sarah was horrified to learn that she had been purchased by a man who mentioned plans to transport her to a private island in the Caribbean. But Even as she faced the prospect of being sold into sexual slavery, Sarah's military mind was already formulating a plan. She had gathered enough intelligence to understand the scope of the operation, identify key players, and locate crucial evidence. Now, she needed to find a way to communicate with her FBI contact and coordinate a rescue operation. As the evening wound down and the merchandise was being prepared for transport, Sarah knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. According to the conversation she had overheard, the selected women would be moved out of the prison within the next 48 hours. The women were taken to a secure holding area in the basement of the prison, where they would be kept until transportation arrangements were finalized. The area consisted of 4 small cells with reinforced doors and no windows. It was clearly designed to hold people who were never intended to be seen again. As Sarah was locked into her cell, she began to assess her situation. The guards had taken her prison uniform and given her civilian clothes, a clear sign that her identity as an inmate was about to be erased permanently. Within days, the official records would probably show that Sofia Martinez had been released or transferred, just like all the other women who had disappeared. But Admiral Sarah Chun was not going down without a fight. She had infiltrated one of the most sophisticated criminal operations she had ever encountered, and she had enough evidence to bring down a network that had destroyed countless lives. Now, she just needed to find a way to survive long enough to use it. In the darkness of her basement cell, surrounded by the sounds of other women crying and praying, Sarah began to plan her escape. She had 48 hours to break out, contact the FBI, and coordinate a rescue operation that would save not just herself, but all the other victims of this horrific trafficking ring. The mission that had started as an investigation into missing prisoners had become a race against time to expose one of the most evil criminal enterprises she had ever encountered. And failure was not an option. The basement holding cells were designed to break the human spirit. No natural light penetrated the concrete walls, and the only illumination came from a single fluorescent bulb that flickered constantly, creating an atmosphere of psychological torture. Sarah had been locked in cell 3 for 18 hours now, and she could hear the other women in nearby cells crying, praying, and slowly losing hope. But Admiral Sarah Chun was not losing hope. She was planning. During her years as a Navy SEAL, Sarah had been trained in escape and evasion techniques that few people in the world possessed. She had studied the psychology of captivity, the physics of lockpicking, and the art of improvised weapons. More importantly, she had been taught that every prison has weaknesses and every captor makes mistakes. The first mistake her captors had made was underestimating her. They saw Sofia Martinez, a scared young woman convicted of armed robbery. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had led special operations missions in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The second mistake was the cell itself. While the door was reinforced and the lock was high quality, the walls were older concrete that had developed hairline cracks over the years. Sarah had spent hours examining these cracks with her fingertips, mapping their extent and testing their structural integrity. The third mistake was the guard rotation schedule. Sarah had been listening carefully to the footsteps in the corridor outside her cell, and she had identified a pattern. Every 4 hours, there was a 15-minute window when the guards changed shifts, and the basement was briefly unmonitored. But the most significant mistake was that they had left her alone with 3 other women who were facing the same fate. One of them was Jessica, a 22-year-old who had been arrested for drug possession and was scheduled to be shipped overseas the next day. Another was Maria, a 30-year-old mother of 2 who had been caught shoplifting to feed her children. The third was Carmen, the same woman Sarah had seen disappear from the kitchen weeks earlier. Sarah realized that Carmen's presence meant the traffickers sometimes kept victims for extended periods before shipping them out. This suggested they had holding facilities beyond just the prison basement, which meant the operation was even larger than she had initially suspected. Using a technique she had learned in SEER, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, Training, Sarah began to communicate with the other women through a series of gentle taps on the concrete walls. It was a crude form of Morse code, but it allowed her to gather crucial information without alerting the guards. From Carmen, she learned that there were at least a dozen other women being held in various locations around the prison complex. Some were in an abandoned wing of the building that was officially closed for renovations. Others were being kept in shipping containers that had been converted into temporary holding cells. From Jessica, she learned that the guards had mentioned a departure schedule that included specific times and transportation methods. The women were going to be moved in small groups to avoid suspicion, with some leaving by truck and others by boat. From Maria, she learned the most disturbing detail of all. This operation had been running for over 3 years, and the traffickers had developed relationships with corrupt officials in at least 5 different states. The network was so extensive that even if this facility was shut down, the organization would simply move to other locations and continue operating. As Sarah processed this information, she realized that her mission had evolved beyond simply gathering evidence about the Riverside prison. She was now sitting at the center of a massive criminal conspiracy that needed to be completely dismantled. But first, she needed to escape and contact her FBI handler. The opportunity came during the 2 a.m. guard shift change. Sarah had been preparing for this moment all day, using the metal fragment she had hidden in her clothing to slowly work at the concrete around one of the cell door hinges. The concrete was old and had been weakened by decades of moisture, making it possible to gradually chip away small pieces without making noise. When she heard the guards leaving for their shift change, Sarah immediately went to work. She had 15 minutes to get out of her cell, free the other women, and find a way to contact the outside world. It was an impossible timeline for most people, but Sarah had faced worse odds in hostile territory with armed enemies hunting her. The hinge gave way after 5 minutes of intense work, allowing Sarah to push the cell door open just wide enough to squeeze through. The corridor was empty, but she could hear voices coming from the guard station at the end of the hallway. Moving with the silent precision that had made her one of the Navy's most elite operators, she made her way to the other cells. The lock mechanism was the same on all the cells, and Sarah was able to free Jessica, Maria, and Carmen within 3 minutes. But when she tried to lead them toward the exit, she encountered a problem she hadn't anticipated. The other women were paralyzed with fear. "We can't leave," Jessica whispered frantically. "If they catch us, they'll kill us. They told us what happens to people who try to escape." Sarah realized that the psychological conditioning the traffickers used was as effective as any physical restraint. These women had been so thoroughly terrorized that they were unable to act even when presented with the opportunity for freedom. Drawing on her leadership training, Sarah took charge of the situation with quiet authority. "Listen to me carefully," she said in a low but commanding voice. "My name is Admiral Sarah Chun, United States Navy. I am an undercover federal agent, and I am here to rescue you. But I need you to trust me and follow my orders exactly. Can you do that?" The revelation shocked the women into momentary silence, but Sarah could see something changing in their eyes. The presence of an authority figure, someone with the power and training to fight back against their captors, began to cut through their conditioned fear. "You're really a Navy officer?" Carmen asked in disbelief. "Yes," Sarah replied firmly. "And I promise you that if you follow my instructions, we're all going home tonight." With the women now willing to follow her lead, Sarah began implementing her escape plan. She had memorized the layout of the basement level during her weeks of observation, and she knew there was a service corridor that connected to the main kitchen. If they could reach the kitchen, they could access the loading dock where food deliveries were made. But first, she needed to gather evidence that would ensure the traffickers couldn't simply relocate and continue their operation elsewhere. "I need to get to the security office," Sarah explained to the group. "There are recordings and documents that will expose this entire network." "Jessica, do you know where they keep the administrative files?" "There's an office upstairs," Jessica replied. "But it's always locked, and There are cameras everywhere. Sarah smiled grimly. Let me worry about the cameras. Moving through the service corridors with practiced stealth, the group made their way toward the administrative section of the prison. Sarah's military training allowed her to navigate in near-total darkness, identifying threats and obstacles by sound and feel alone. When they reached the security office, Sarah encountered her first real challenge. The door was protected by both a traditional lock and an electronic keypad system. But during her weeks of observation, she had noticed that one of the guards always fumbled with the keypad, suggesting it was a common numerical sequence rather than a random code. Using the metal fragment as a lock pick, Sarah managed to defeat the traditional lock within 2 minutes. The electronic keypad took longer, but by trying common sequences, dates, repeated numbers, and simple patterns, she eventually hit upon the correct combination: 1-2-3-4. Inside the office, Sarah found a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded her wildest expectations. There were detailed records going back 3 years, documenting hundreds of victims, financial transactions, and contacts with criminal organizations around the world. There were photographs, shipping manifests, and even video recordings of the auctions where women were sold to the highest bidder. Most importantly, there was a master file that contained the names and contact information of everyone involved in the operation, from the guards and administrators at Riverside to the buyers and transporters who moved the women to their final destinations. Sarah quickly copied the most crucial files onto a USB drive she found in the desk, but she realized she needed more time to properly document everything. That's when she noticed something that changed the entire situation. On one of the computer monitors, she could see live feed from security cameras throughout the prison, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Armed men in tactical gear were moving through the corridors of the prison. But they weren't law enforcement officers. Their equipment and movements suggested they were private security contractors, and they were clearly searching for the escaped prisoners. Even worse, Sarah could see that they had already discovered the empty cells in the basement. It would only be a matter of minutes before they traced the escape route and found Sarah's group. "We need to leave now," Sarah told the other women urgently. But as they prepared to exit the office, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor outside. They were trapped. Drawing on her combat experience, Sarah quickly assessed their tactical situation. They were outnumbered and outgunned in an unfamiliar building with 3 civilian women who had no combat training. Any direct confrontation would result in casualties, and Sarah's primary mission was to get these women to safety. That's when she noticed something that gave her an idea. The security office had access to the prison's PA system, and Sarah realized she could use it to create confusion and misdirection. She quickly activated the system and began broadcasting a message that would change everything. "Attention all law enforcement agencies," Sarah announced in her most authoritative voice. "This is Admiral Sarah Chun, United States Navy, operating under FBI authority. Riverside Correctional Facility is currently under federal investigation for human trafficking. Armed suspects are present in the building. I repeat, this facility is under federal investigation." The announcement echoed throughout the prison, and Sarah could immediately see its effect on the security monitors. The armed searchers stopped in their tracks, clearly uncertain how to respond to the revelation that they were dealing with a federal agent rather than an escaped prisoner. But Sarah knew the confusion would only last a few minutes. Soon, the traffickers would realize they had no choice but to eliminate all witnesses and destroy the evidence, regardless of the consequences. Using the moment of confusion, Sarah led her group out of the office and toward the service stairs that would take them to the main floor. But as they reached the stairwell, they came face to face with Officer Brooks, the corrupt guard who had been involved in the operation from the beginning. Brooks was armed with a pistol, and his face showed the desperation of a man who knew his criminal empire was collapsing around him. Well, Brooks said with a cold smile. "Looks like we got ourselves a real live Navy SEAL. Too bad you're going to have an accident before anyone can verify your story." Sarah positioned herself between Brooks and the other women, her mind calculating distances and reaction times. She had spent years training in close-quarters combat, but she was unarmed and responsible for protecting 3 civilians. "It's over, Brooks," Sarah said calmly. "The FBI knows everything. The recordings, the files, the client lists, it's all been transmitted to federal agents. Killing us won't change anything." Brooks laughed harshly. "Maybe not, but it'll sure make me feel better." As Brooks raised his weapon, Sarah made her move. Years of combat training took over as she lunged forward, using her speed and the element of surprise to close the distance before Brooks could fire. The 2 combatants crashed into the stairwell wall, fighting for control of the weapon. But Sarah had advantages that Brooks couldn't have anticipated. She was trained in multiple forms of hand-to-hand combat. She was in peak physical condition, and most importantly, she was fighting for the lives of innocent women rather than her own criminal interests. The struggle was brief, but intense. Sarah used a combination of strikes and leverage techniques to disarm Brooks and render him unconscious. When it was over, she stood over his motionless form, breathing heavily but uninjured. "Is he dead?" Maria asked fearfully. "No, Sarari Plaid. Checking Brooks' pulse. Just unconscious. But we need to keep moving." With Brooks' weapon now in her possession, Sarah felt more confident about their chances of reaching safety. But she also knew that the other corrupt guards and security contractors would soon realize what had happened to their colleague. As the group made their way toward the main floor, Sarah could hear sirens in the distance. Her announcement over the PA system had apparently prompted someone to call law enforcement, which meant help was on the way. But they still had to survive long enough for that help to arrive. The sound of sirens was getting closer, but Sarah knew they weren't out of danger yet. As she led Jessica, Maria, and Carmen through the darkened corridors of Riverside Correctional, she could hear radio chatter and urgent voices coming from different parts of the building. The traffickers were coordinating their response, and Sarah suspected they were planning to eliminate all evidence of their operation, including any potential witnesses. When the group reached the main kitchen, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. Through the windows, she could see several vehicles moving around the prison grounds, their headlights cutting through the darkness like search beams. Some were official prison vehicles, but others appeared to be unmarked trucks and vans that had no business being at the facility. "They're destroying evidence," Sarah realized, watching as men carried boxes and equipment out of various buildings. "They're going to claim this was all a false alarm and disappear before law enforcement gets here." Carmen grabbed Sarah's arm, her voice filled with panic. "What about the other women? The ones you said were being held in other parts of the prison?" Sarah felt a surge of anger as she realized the traffickers were probably planning to move or eliminate the other victims to prevent them from corroborating Sarah's story. These weren't just criminals. They were predators who had turned human trafficking into a business model, and they would do anything to protect their operation. "We're going to save them," Sarah said firmly. "But first, I need to contact my FBI handler and make sure the evidence we gather gets to the right people." Using the kitchen phone, Sarah dialed the emergency contact number she had memorized before beginning her undercover mission. The call was answered on the first ring. "Agent Morrison," came the familiar voice of her FBI contact. "This is Admiral Chun," Sarah said quickly. "Operation Lighthouse is compromised. I need immediate backup at Riverside Correctional. We have multiple victims in custody and an active trafficking operation in progress." There was a brief pause before Morrison responded. "Admiral, we've been monitoring emergency radio traffic from your location. What's your current status?" "I'm in the main kitchen with 3 rescued victims," Sarah reported. "But there are at least a dozen other women being held throughout the facility. The traffickers are attempting to destroy evidence and possibly eliminate witnesses. I need a full tactical response team here within the hour." "Understood," Morrison replied. "FBI tactical units are en route, along with local law enforcement and federal marshals. Can you maintain your position until they arrive?" Sarah looked out the kitchen window and saw more vehicles arriving at the prison. But these weren't law enforcement vehicles. They appear to be private security contractors or criminal associates helping to cover up the operation. Negative, Sarah said. The situation is deteriorating rapidly. I'm going to attempt to locate and secure the other victims. Admiral, that's not advisable, Morrison warned. Your mission was intelligence gathering, not tactical intervention. Wait for backup. But Sarah had already made her decision. She had spent her entire military career protecting the innocent and fighting against those who would prey on the vulnerable. She wasn't going to hide in the kitchen while women were being murdered or transported to lives of slavery. Agent Morrison, I'm going dark for operational security, Sarah said. Coordinate with local law enforcement to secure the perimeter. I'll maintain contact when possible. She hung up the phone and turned to address the 3 women she had already rescued. I need you to stay here and wait for the FBI agents, she told them. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone unless they can prove they're federal agents. Where are you going? Jessica asked fearfully. To get the others, Sarah replied, checking the ammunition in Brooke's pistol. I didn't come here to save 3 people. I came here to save everyone. Maria stepped forward, her voice stronger than Sarah had heard it before. Take me with you. I know where they keep some of the women. I've seen the guards moving them around. Sarah was touched by Maria's courage, but she shook her head. You're not trained for this kind of operation. I need you safe so you can testify against these people. Then, at least let us help coordinate, Carmen insisted. We know this place better than you do. We can watch from here and radio you if we see anything dangerous. Sarah realized that Carmen was right. She had been focused on the tactical aspects of the mission, but local knowledge could be just as valuable as combat training. After finding a 2-way radio in one of the guard stations, she gave it to Carmen and established a communication protocol. Channel 7, Sarah instructed. If you see anything that might threaten the rescue operation, let me know immediately. Armed with Brooke's weapon and guided by the intelligence she had gathered over the past weeks, Sarah set out to locate the other victims. Her first destination was the abandoned wing of the prison that Carmen had mentioned, a section that was officially closed for renovations, but was apparently being used as an additional holding area. As she moved through the service corridors toward the abandoned wing, Sarah's radio crackled to life. Sarah, this is Carmen, came the whispered voice. There's a group of men with guns heading toward the basement area where you found us. I think they're going to destroy the holding cells. Sarah felt a surge of urgency. If the traffickers destroyed the basement area, they would eliminate crucial physical evidence of their operation. More importantly, they might harm other victims who are still being held there. How many men? Sarah asked quietly into the radio. I count 4, Carmen replied. They're carrying what look like gasoline containers. Sarah realized the traffickers were planning to burn the evidence, which would also serve the purpose of eliminating any remaining witnesses. She had to stop them before they could complete their mission. Moving with the stealth and precision that had made her one of the Navy's most effective special operators, Sarah made her way toward the basement level. She could smell gasoline fumes before she could see the men, confirming Carmen's observation about their intentions. The 4 men were methodically dousing the holding cells and surrounding areas with accelerant, preparing to turn the basement into an inferno that would destroy all evidence of the trafficking operation. They were so focused on their task that they didn't notice Sarah's approach until it was too late. Sarah's military training had taught her that in situations involving multiple armed opponents, speed and surprise were more important than superior firepower. She used these principles to neutralize 2 of the men before they could react, using non-lethal techniques that would keep them alive to face justice. The 3rd man managed to draw his weapon, but Sarah's superior training and positioning allowed her to disarm him with a combination of movement and precision shooting that wounded rather than killed him. The 4th man, however, had positioned himself near what appeared to be an electrical control panel. As Sarah approached, he smiled coldly and reached for a switch. One more step, and I fry the whole basement, he threatened, along with anyone who might be down here. Sarah realized he was talking about more than just destroying evidence. if there were additional victims being held in the basement areas she hadn't yet explored. An electrical fire could kill them all. Where are they? Sarah demanded, keeping her weapon trained on the man. Where are what? He replied mockingly. The other women, the ones being held down here. The man's expression told Sarah everything she needed to know. There were indeed other victims in the basement, and this man was prepared to kill them all to protect the trafficking operation. But Sarah had spent years dealing with desperate criminals who thought they held all the cards. She had learned that even the most dangerous situation could be turned to her advantage if she remained calm and thought tactically. You know what I think? Sarah said conversationally, slowly moving to position herself at a better angle. I think you're bluffing. If you were really willing to destroy this place, you would have already done it instead of standing here talking to me. The man's confidence wavered slightly, which was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for. In that moment of uncertainty, she made her move. Using a technique she had perfected in close-quarters combat training, Sarah simultaneously dove to the side and fired a carefully aimed shot that struck the man's hand, causing him to release the electrical switch. Before he could recover, she was on him, using hand-to-hand combat techniques to subdue him without causing permanent injury. With the immediate threat neutralized, Sarah began searching the basement areas she hadn't yet explored. What she found was even worse than she had imagined. In a series of converted storage rooms, she discovered 8 more women in various stages of physical and psychological abuse. Some had clearly been held for weeks or even months, while others appeared to have been recently captured. All of them were in desperate need of medical attention and psychological support. But as Sarah began the process of freeing these additional victims, her radio crackled with an urgent message from Carmen. Sarah, you need to get out of there now, came the panicked voice. There's a whole convoy of trucks pulling up outside. At least 20 armed men getting out. And they're not law enforcement. Sarah realized that the traffickers had called in reinforcements, probably other criminal organizations that had a stake in keeping the operation secret. She was now facing a situation that even her extensive training might not be sufficient to handle. But as she looked at the terrified faces of the women she had just found, Sarah knew she couldn't abandon them. These were somebody's daughters, sisters, mothers. They had already suffered unimaginable horrors, and she wasn't going to let them suffer anymore. Using her radio, Sarah contacted Agent Morrison again. Morrison, this is Chun. I've located 11 additional victims in the basement level, but I'm about to be overrun by hostile forces. What's the ETA on that backup? Admiral, FBI tactical units are still 15 minutes out, Morrison replied. Local law enforcement has been delayed by some kind of communication interference. You need to extract immediately. Sarah looked at the women surrounding her and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Negative, Agent Morrison. I'm not leaving these women behind. Advise tactical units that they're going to be dealing with a fortified position and multiple hostiles. And tell them to hurry. As Sarah began organizing the rescued women and preparing defensive positions, she could hear the sound of boots on stairs and urgent voices echoing through the basement corridors. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Admiral Sarah Chun was going to make sure that when it was over, justice would prevail. The stakes had never been higher, and Sarah had never been more determined to complete her mission. The basement of Riverside Correctional had become a war zone. Sarah could hear at least 20 sets of footsteps moving through the corridors above her, and the radio chatter she intercepted suggested the traffickers had brought in professional mercenaries to eliminate all evidence of their operation, including the victims and Sarah herself. But Admiral Sarah Chun had faced worse odds in Afghanistan and Iraq. The difference was that this time, she wasn't fighting for strategic objectives or political goals. She was fighting for the lives of 14 innocent women who had been betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect them. Sarah had positioned the rescued women in the most secure area of the basement, a former cold storage room with thick concrete walls and only one entrance. She had given the strongest among them makeshift weapons and basic instructions on how to defend themselves if the worst happened. "Listen to me carefully," Sarah told them in a quiet but firm voice. "Federal agents are on their way, but we need to hold this position until they arrive. If anyone comes through that door who isn't wearing FBI gear, you fight back with everything you have. These people have already shown they're willing to kill to protect their operation." Maria, who had emerged as a natural leader among the rescued women, stepped forward. "What about you? You're not staying here with us." Sarah shook her head. "I'm going to slow them down and buy time for the FBI to get here. But more importantly, I need to make sure they don't destroy the evidence we gathered. Without that evidence, these monsters will just relocate and start over somewhere else." Carmen grabbed Sarah's hand. "You saved our lives. Don't throw away yours for a bunch of files." Sarah smiled, touched by the concern in Carmen's voice. "Those files are going to save thousands of other women who don't even know they're in danger yet. This operation connects to criminal networks in at least 12 countries. If we can expose it completely, we can prevent countless future victims." As Sarah prepared to leave the secured area, her radio crackled with a message from Agent Morrison. "Admiral Chun, this is Morrison. FBI tactical units are 8 minutes out. Can you maintain your position?" "Negative," Sarah replied. "The hostiles are attempting to destroy evidence in the administrative section. I'm moving to intercept." "Admiral, that's a direct order. Maintain your defensive position until backup arrives." Sarah paused for a moment, considering her response. Agent Morrison was technically her superior for this operation, and military discipline was deeply ingrained in her character. But she also knew that 8 minutes might be enough time for the traffickers to destroy years of evidence and disappear forever. "Agent Morrison, with all due respect, I'm not going to let these criminals escape justice because I followed orders to hide in a basement," Sarah said firmly. "I've secured the victims in a defensible position. I'm going to complete the mission." Without waiting for a response, Sarah switched off her radio and prepared to move out. But as she reached the door of the cold storage room, she heard something that changed everything. Gunfire. Lots of it. And it was coming from the upper levels of the prison. Sarah realized that the FBI tactical units had arrived ahead of schedule, and they were already engaging the traffickers' mercenaries. This was both good news and bad news. The good news was that professional backup had arrived. The bad news was that the traffickers might accelerate their timeline for destroying evidence. Moving with the silent precision that had made her one of the Navy's most elite operators, Sarah made her way through the basement corridors toward the stairs that led to the administrative section. The sounds of combat were growing louder, with automatic weapons fire echoing through the building. As Sarah reached the main floor, she encountered her first hostile contact. 2 armed men were moving toward the administrative wing, carrying what appeared to be incendiary devices. Sarah recognized the type immediately. They were designed to create intense heat that would destroy computer equipment and paper documents within minutes. Sarah's military training took over as she engaged the 2 men. Using the element of surprise and her superior tactical skills, she was able to neutralize both threats without sustaining injury. But she knew there would be more where they came from. The administrative section was in chaos. Sarah could see that several offices had already been ransacked, with file cabinets overturned and computer equipment smashed. But the main security office, the one containing the master files about the trafficking operation, was still intact. As Sarah approached the security office, she came face to face with the silver-haired man she had seen at the auction dinner. He was standing in the doorway with a laptop computer in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Well, if it isn't our undercover Navy SEAL," he said with a cold smile. "I have to admit, you certainly caused us some inconvenience." Sarah kept her weapon trained on him while scanning for additional threats. "It's over. The FBI has the building surrounded, and they have copies of all your files." The man laughed. "Actually, they don't. This laptop contains the only complete record of our operation, including client lists, financial transactions, and transportation schedules. Without it, they have nothing but the testimony of a few criminals, hardly enough to bring down an organization of our scope." Sarah realized he was probably right. While she had copied some files earlier, the complete database was likely stored on the computer he was holding. Of course, I could be persuaded to surrender this information, the man continued, in exchange for safe passage out of the country. Not happening, Sarah replied firmly. Then, I suppose we're at an impasse, he said, raising his weapon. But Sarah had been in countless life-or-death situations, and she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was about to fire. She saw the slight tensing of his trigger finger and moved accordingly. The gunfight was brief but intense. Sarah's superior training and positioning allowed her to wound the trafficker without killing him, but not before he managed to activate some kind of device attached to the laptop. Dead man switch, he gasped as he fell. 30 seconds, and that computer fries itself along with all the data. Sarah rushed to the laptop and saw a countdown timer on the screen. 28 seconds and falling. She had to make a choice. Try to disarm the device, or accept that some of the evidence might be lost. Drawing on her technical training from the Navy, Sarah quickly assessed the device. It was sophisticated but not impenetrable. Using techniques she had learned for disarming improvised explosive devices, she managed to disconnect the timer with 7 seconds to spare. As she secured the laptop, Sarah heard footsteps in the corridor behind her. She spun around, weapon ready, but relaxed when she saw FBI tactical gear and proper identification. Admiral Chun asked the lead agent. That's me, Sarah confirmed. The building is secure, but there are 14 victims in the basement who need immediate medical attention. We've already located them, the agent replied. Paramedics are attending to them now. Agent Morrison wants to debrief you as soon as possible. Sarah nodded, but there's something else she needed to do first. What about the other facilities? This operation has connections to trafficking networks in multiple states and countries. That's where you come in, said a familiar voice. Agent Morrison appeared in the doorway, looking both relieved and impressed. The information you've gathered is going to allow us to coordinate simultaneous raids on trafficking operations across 3 continents. Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over Riverside Correctional, Sarah found herself at the center of one of the largest law enforcement operations in modern history. The laptop she had secured contained evidence linking the prison trafficking ring to criminal organizations in Europe, Asia, and South America. Coordinated raids were conducted simultaneously in 12 countries, resulting in the rescue of over 200 trafficking victims and the arrest of dozens of high-level criminals. The network that had seemed so impenetrable just hours earlier was completely dismantled in a single operation. But for Sarah, the most satisfying moment came when she saw Jessica, Maria, Carmen, and the other rescued women being loaded into ambulances for medical care. They were going home to their families, something that would never have happened if Sarah hadn't taken a risk to go undercover. Agent Morrison approached Sarah as she watched the last of the victims being taken to safety. Admiral, I have to ask, when I ordered you to maintain your defensive position, why did you disobey? Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious but not apologetic. Agent Morrison, I've spent 15 years in the military following orders and completing missions. But this wasn't just a mission. These women weren't just sources of intelligence. They were human beings who deserved to be protected, regardless of the risks involved. Morrison nodded slowly. The Navy trained you well, Admiral, both in terms of tactical skills and moral courage. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Sarah found herself reflecting on the events of the past weeks. She had entered Riverside Correctional as Sophia Martinez, a convicted criminal with no hope and no future. She was leaving as Admiral Sarah Chun, a federal agent who had helped dismantle one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in the world. But the real victory wasn't in the arrests or the headlines that would follow. It was in the knowledge that 14 women who had been written off by society were now free to rebuild their lives. It was in the certainty that hundreds of potential future victims would never experience the horrors of human trafficking because the network had been destroyed. 3 months later, Sarah stood in a federal courtroom watching as the last of the trafficking conspirators was sentenced to life in prison. The silver-haired man who had led the organization had cooperated fully with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing information that led to additional arrests and rescues. Officer Brooks and the other corrupt prison staff had been sentenced to lengthy prison terms and would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. The prison administration had been completely overhauled, with new leadership and oversight procedures designed to prevent similar corruption in the future. But perhaps the most meaningful moment for Sarah came when she received a letter from Carmen, who had enrolled in community college and was studying to become a social worker. The letter was simple but profound. "Dear Admiral Chun, I wanted you to know that I think about you every day and what you did for us. You didn't just save our lives. You gave us back our future. I'm going to spend the rest of my life helping other women who find themselves in situations like we were in. Thank you for showing me that there are still people in this world who will fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. You are my hero." As Sarah folded the letter and put it in her desk drawer, she smiled. She had received medals and commendations for her military service, but no recognition had ever meant as much to her as those simple words from a woman whose life she had helped save. The mission at Riverside Correctional had officially ended months ago, but Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. There were other trafficking networks to expose, other victims to rescue, and other criminals to bring to justice. And Admiral Sarah Chun would be ready for whatever came next.